I am thrilled to introduce you all to Valerie Tiberius. She is the Paul W. Frenzel Chair in Liberal Arts and Professor of Philosophy at University of Minnesota, where she has taught since 1998. She earned her BA from the University of Toronto and her MA and PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her work explores the way in which philosophy and psychology can both contribute to the study of well-being and virtue. This concern is central to her most recent book, which shares its title with tonight's talk, Well-Being as Value Fulfillment, How We Can Help Each Other to Live Well, which came out just a couple of weeks ago. Congratulations. She is also the author of The Reflective Life, Living Wisely Within Our Limits, which examines how we ought to think about practical wisdom and living a good life, given what we now know about ourselves from empirical psychology. Her most recent book, Moral Psychology, A Contemporary Introduction, brings together traditional philosophical approaches and new empirical approaches in order to investigate topics such as moral motivation, moral responsibility, and the reasons to be moral. She has also published literally dozens of articles on topics of practical reasoning, prudential virtues, well-being, and the relation between positive psychology and ethics, and has received grants from the John Templeton Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. She has recently served as president of the Central Division of the American Philosophical Association. Please join me in welcoming Valerie Tiberius.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is that loud enough? Okay, good. It's really an honor to be here. Thank you for the lovely introduction. This is weird to have a standing room only. That's not normal for philosophy talks, but I'll try to cope. And knowing that a lot of you probably don't have any philosophy background, I'll try to adjust things as we go so that you can follow what I'm talking about. How did the slide jump without my doing anything? Okay, right. So this is the book that I'm going to be talking about today. If I have time, I'll give you a little new stuff that isn't in the book. This book arrived, my copy of it arrived on Election Day, and it was kind of, the excitement of it was overshadowed by the excitement of the election. But I'm now pleased that it's available to purchase. These books are books about happiness written by psychologists, and some of you may have seen books like this in the bookstore because these books are actually popular and will sell lots of copies, unlike books that philosophers write. So psychologists have been doing a lot of research on happiness and well-being and talking a lot about what it is, what causes it, what it causes. For example, this guy, Ed Diener, who's sometimes called Dr. Happiness, is doing a lot of work on what the concept that he calls subjective well-being. Ed Diener invented the life satisfaction scale, which is one of the main measures that psychologists use when they do their research on happiness and well-being. It's a scale that asks 5 questions. The main gist of those questions is just, how do you think your life is going? How satisfied are you with your life right now? And you get a 7-point scale. That is what psychologists take happiness to be, your own assessment of how satisfied you are with your life. I was at a talk, I shared a stage with Ed Diener recently, and he presented some absolutely fascinating data. Actually, he didn't really present the data because it was a big, popular, a public talk, but he presented the conclusions of the data. So he talked about some of the beneficial outcomes that are caused by subjective well-being. And again, subjective well-being means life satisfaction, and also, I should have said, positive feelings. So positive affect, as it's called in psychology. So all of these things are caused by subjective well-being. People with higher subjective well-being are healthier. They are less likely to smoke, more likely to use their seatbelts, and so on. People who are high in subjective well-being live longer than people who are lower in subjective well-being. Happy people, and again, that means people high in subjective well-being, are more likely to get married, stay married, have more friends, people like them more. You might wonder, okay, that's great. If you are a happy person, you can have the benefits of all of those outcomes. But what if you're not a happy person? Can you become happier? Well, according to psychologists, yes, you can. Some of your happiness is set genetic by your genes, but some of your happiness is not set by your genes, and the stuff that you do with your life can change how happy you are. So Ed Diener presented, Dr. Happiness, he presented some work that they had done on a kind of 10-week happiness course that you could take as part of this research. In that course, they focused on these kinds of concepts and ideas. Some of these things may be familiar to you, so you might have heard that, oops, hey, there we go. Oh, I know, there it is. I have a pointer. It's pretty exciting for me. I'm not that high tech. But you might have heard that gratitude journals, keeping a journal of your blessings, writing down 3 things that you're grateful for every evening can increase your happiness. Performing random acts of kindness can also have that effect. Practicing mindfulness exercises. These are all the kinds of things that were in this enhanced 10-week course, and they were shown to increase life satisfaction in the people who took the course, and in a fairly lasting way. If you want to know more about how to increase your subjective well-being, you could read some of these books, especially this one by Lyubomirsky. The How of Happiness is really focused on these techniques, how to use those techniques to make yourself happier. But I'm not a psychologist. I'm a philosopher. I'm not going to measure happiness. Philosophers don't really create measures, and we don't really, most of us do empirical research. Most of us do not do empirical research. I'm not going to do experiments or find out who's happier and who's more unhappy. So what the heck are philosophers good for? What's the point of thinking about these concepts from a philosophical standpoint? Well, for me, the point is that psychologists measure what they can measure, but they can't answer questions about what actually matters and what it's actually worth measuring. They admit this. They don't claim to be talking about what is good or valuable or what matters. They just claim to be talking about the quite limited, constrained psychological phenomena that they are actually capable of measuring. So if you want to know what matters, what's important, what we ought to promote, what we ought to go for in our lives, you can't look to a psychologist. What they can tell you is, if you want more life satisfaction, if what you want in life is to feel satisfied with your life, they can tell you how to do that. But I think psychologists can't tell us what we should aim at for ourselves or in our societies. And that's what I'm hoping to talk about today. So for the rest of the talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview about philosophical theories of well-being, so you can see what the kind of landscape is. I'm going to talk about my own theory that I'm defending in the book, and I'll say a little bit about why I think it's a good theory. I'm thinking that I probably will not get to section 4, but if I do, then I will. All right, so first, a little bit about other theories, the lay of the land it's been the lay of the land for quite a while. So one philosophical theory of well-being goes back to Aristotle, and it's a theory called perfectionism. Perfectionism says that a good life for a person, the well-lived life, the life you should aim at, is a life in which you exercise your quintessentially human capacities in an excellent way. So there's something that it is to be a human being. There are capacities you have in virtue of being a member of the human species, and to activate or exercise those capacities well, that's what a good life is. That's what you should aim at. Notice that that's very different from feeling like your life is going well. You could feel like your life is going well and be completely deluded. Aristotle wanted us to actually be using our human capacities. So that's perfectionism. What's the problem with perfectionism? Why am I not a perfectionist? These days, and even though I think philosophy is different from psychology, I'm very influenced by psychologists. And these days, the idea that our human nature and our human capacities are the foundation for goodness, that idea seems a little suspicious, given what many scientists are telling us about the kinds of things humans do that are quite natural. So the idea of identifying what's naturally human, just in virtue of being a member of the species, with goodness is, I think, kind of under a cloud now. Because we have some good features naturally. We also have some really terrible features naturally, like the capacity to go to war against each other and hurt each other in some dreadful ways. So enough about perfectionism. How about hedonism? Hedonism, also an ancient theory. There were ancient hedonists. There are contemporary hedonists. Utilitarianism, which is a moral theory that some of you may have heard of, that's a theory that's based on hedonism, the idea that the good life for a person is a life that gets more pleasure than pain. So hedonism, basically, the idea is a good life is a pleasant life and a life without a lot of pain. So the problem with hedonism is that it really seems like there are other things in life that are good besides pleasure, if you think about it. One way to think about it is to think about this thought experiment that was written about by Robert Nozick. So the thought experiment is called the experience machine. What you're supposed to imagine that you could hook yourself up to a kind of, this was written in the 70s, so Nozick didn't know what was coming, but he describes it as a machine that is controlled by super duper neurophysiologists. He actually says that, super duper neurophysiologists. And these people are going to guarantee, by manipulating your brain, that you experience more pleasure than you would if you didn't hook up to the machine. Now, some of you are probably thinking, that sounds great. In my Intro to Ethics class, when I teach hedonism, I always have a handful of students who say, sign me up right now. But most people don't like the idea of hooking up to an experience machine, even if, and this is part of the thought experiment, even if the machine guarantees that you will have more pleasure. And that's because the thought is that there are other things that matter in life besides pleasure. Things like deep and meaningful relationships with other people, like comrades in war, which is not your fellow soldiers, which is not a pleasant type of experience, but there's something about those relationships that's very valuable to the people who have them. Knowledge, a lot of people think that knowledge is really valuable and important, even if it doesn't create pleasure. Some people think that achievement, accomplishment, and here's a very tired marathon runner who doesn't look like he's enjoying a lot of pleasure at the moment. What's good about that experience is the achievement or accomplishment, and that the idea is that's good independently of the pleasure that it causes. So, third theory, it's the last one I'm going to talk about before I get to my own, is the desire satisfaction theory. And this theory, it's quite simple. It basically says that the good life for a person, what counts as well-being for a person, is getting what you want. That's quite simple. Now, some people say it's not just what you happen to want at the moment, but what you would want if you were fairly informed about your situation. Okay, so there might be a little bit of qualification there. Not every actual desire you have, but informed desires. The problem with this theory is that, again, it seems like we often want things that are not good for us. We sometimes want very trivial things. I really love candy corn, and I always want to have some around Halloween. I have type 1 diabetes. Eating candy corns is not really that great for me. If I were even informed about how much sugar is in the candy corn, that would not change my desire for them. That's how much I enjoy those chewy little weird combinations of flavor. Those things are delicious. I want that. Is it good for me to get that? Well, not really. Does it contribute to my well-being to get candy corns? Is my life worse if I don't get candy corns? I don't think so. Some people want to avoid medical treatment that would be very good for them. What they want is to avoid a shot, but the shot, if it's, say, a flu vaccine, would be good for them. Some people want to waste their lives sitting around doing nothing. Is that good for them just because it's what they want? A lot of people think not. Some people want to do things that are deeply immoral, like Ramsey over here. Is that good for them? Some people just want to do really stupid things, like lie on tigers. Is that good for that person who wants to do that? It's not clear. So the problem with the desire satisfaction theory is our wants can have objects that just really intuitively don't seem to be very good for us. So it's problematic as a theory of what's good for people, what well-being is. So I want to present a different theory, which is the value fulfillment theory. And according to this theory, what it is for your life to go well is for you to fulfill the appropriate values that you have, to fulfill your appropriate values over time. So what does that mean? Well, the first thing you need to know is what are values. I don't mean objective values. I mean your own values, your personal values, the things that you value. And what it is to value something, I think, is to have this harmonized, coordinated pattern of psychological attitudes towards the thing that you value. So you have emotions and desires and judgments about the thing that you value. You judge it to be something worth planning for, something you have reason to choose and take the means to. That's what it is to value something. What are appropriate values? Well, really quickly, appropriate values are values that are fitting to your psychological states. So values that suit the kinds of emotional responses that you have in life, the kinds of values that fit the desires that you have, they're not in conflict with your desires, the kinds of values that also fit the judgments that you have about what's good for you. So values are a little bit of an ideal. We don't all enjoy perfect psychological harmony, and sometimes all these different states of emotions, desires, and judgments are in conflict. But in the ideal case, an appropriate value has all these three things, desires, emotions, and judgments, integrated, working together. What's fulfillment? Well, fulfillment is just success by the standards of the values that you have. So let's say you value family. Different people have different kinds of standards for what it means to fulfill the value of family. For some people, that might mean you have to get married and have children. That's absolutely essential. If you value family, you will have a family. You will have your own children. If you value, and for other people, that's not the case. For people who already have children, valuing the relationship that you have with a child, or you can imagine, I'm realizing 90% of the people in this room certainly don't have children yet, but so imagine a relationship you have with somebody in your family. You're going to feel, you're going to have certain emotional feelings about those people. You're likely to feel, let's take the example of, your relationship with your mom. Something good happens to her, you're likely to feel proud or joy or just pleased for her. You're going to want to remember her birthday, go home at Thanksgiving to visit her. Fulfilling the value means living up to those standards that you have. If you think that what it means to value family is remembering family members' birthdays, making an effort to see them at major holidays, talking nicely to them, being respectful, whatever your standards are for the value of family, they define what fulfillment is. I don't think I will go into the different kinds of standards there are, but one thing I do want to point out is these standards are not just all discretionary. So if you have, as a standard for, let's say there's a sport that you value, oh boy, now I really wish I knew something about football, because I think that would be an example that you all could relate to. But I know nothing about football, so instead I'll talk about running marathons, which I know almost nothing about, but slightly more than football. At least marathons are very simple. You just run along for a long time, whereas football, it's a lot of rules. So let's say you value running marathons. If one of the things that you value is making a better time than you did last time, let's say that's one of your standards for fulfilling that value, is doing better than you did last time. Well, it's not up to you whether you did better or not. That's not just, you don't get to make that up. You either did better or you didn't, and that's determined by the clock, not by your head, right? Okay, so value fulfillment gets very complicated when we start talking about multiple values. So most people, there's really hardly any people, it's very unlikely to find a person who only values running marathons. Most people value their work, they value friendship, they value family relationships. Of course, they value the particular people that they're in relationship with. They might have hobbies or sports that they value, a hobby like collecting antique teacups. You might value your relationship with your pets, not family or friendship quite, but a different sort of relationship. So most people have lots of different values. We have these values at different levels. Some values are very abstract, like you might value art, but then you also value particular ways of appreciating art. So let's say you value music, and the particular goal you have that sort of realizes that value is that you want to go to concerts, or you play the piano, or you sing, or whatever. You do karaoke. So we have a lot of different values, different kinds of values at different levels. So total value fulfillment is pretty complicated because you have to pay attention to all the different values, how those values are related to each other, and how they can be fulfilled over the whole course of your life. So are your values going to conflict with each other and make it more difficult to fulfill one of them because it's in conflict with something else you value. For instance, if you value a career as an astronaut and you really want to go on a ship to Mars, spaceship that would be, and you also value being a parent, and the way you want to be a parent is to be a stay-at-home parent, that's a recipe for disaster, because those two values can't be done in the same life. Mars is going to take you away from home, and you're not going to be able to be a stay-at-home parent. Unless you could take your kid to Mars, but I don't think that's probably quite a ways into the future. Okay, so why this theory? I mean, in a way, the value fulfillment theory is as simple as the desire satisfaction theory. It's complicated in all the details, but the basic idea is people have values, you fulfill those values, and that's what's good for you. With the added, the difference from the desire satisfaction theory being we're talking about values, not desires, and the values have to be appropriate to you and appropriate together, so you can fulfill all of them over a whole lifetime. Why this theory? 3 reasons. First of all, I think it doesn't have the problems that the other theories have. So perfectionism, my value fulfillment theory doesn't say that human nature defines the good. Of course, human nature is important because human nature shapes what we value. We are social creatures, and almost everybody values their relationships with other people in their communities. That wouldn't be true if it weren't for our human nature, but human nature, it's not the fact that it's our nature that is explaining the goodness of those relationships. So human nature constrains what we value, but it's not the source of value in the way that it is for perfectionism. Hedonism, the value fulfillment theory does say that pleasure is important because pleasure is valued by people, but it doesn't say that pleasure is the only value. So it doesn't have that problem. The desire satisfaction theory had the problem that a lot of our desires seem to be targeted on things that are downright bad for us. The value fulfillment theory offers ways of improving our values. So because it takes appropriate values to be the key to well-being, it gives us grounds for criticizing the values that people actually have. So you could say that somebody values being in a terrible relationship with somebody who just makes them feel bad all the time. For the value fulfillment theory, we could say, well, yeah, I see that that's what you say you value, but that value isn't appropriate because it doesn't fit with your emotional responses. So the psychological integration that's part of appropriate values, that gives us some room to think about what an improved set of values would be. And that's room that the desire satisfaction theory doesn't really have. Thanks. So, second thing, I think this theory is useful for thinking about how to help people. So one thing we want to do when we help people, especially friends, and the context of helping our friends who are struggling is the main practical context that I talk about in my book. If you have a friend who's actually not doing very well and you want to help them do better, one thing you want to do is help them in a way that's not alienating to them. So if you have a friend who's struggling in, say, a relationship that isn't going well and is making him or her really unhappy, if your approach is just to say, say, forget that guy, I got somebody else for you. Without any, just bring in a new person, like, I know who you should be with, this is the guy, this guy, not that stupid idiot you're dating now. That's generally not a good way of helping people, because if the person is in a relationship with somebody else, they feel threatened by your trying to take over what they're doing. So we want to help people in ways that the helpful way to help people is in ways that are connected to something that they care about. So you can move people and you can help them improve the values that they have, but generally you need to do that by appealing to something that they care about already. On the other hand, though, you don't want to pander to people. You don't want to just say to your friend, oh, if that's what you like, okay, that's fine then, whatever. So when we help people, we want both to be connected to the things that motivate them, and at the same time to have some grounds for getting them to improve the things that they care about. And I think the value fulfillment theory does a pretty nice job of that. A good sort of example is from advising undergraduate students who, when I was the director of undergraduate studies for philosophy, I would often have students who would come into my office and they would say, I'm a biology major, my parents want me to go to med school, I'm going to med school, I want to be a doctor, but I fall asleep in my biology classes and I love philosophy. What should I do? Now, I think these are people whose valuing medicine and a career in medicine is a little shaky. It's not quite appropriate for them. It doesn't fit what they are actually interested in. But they're doing it because their parents want them to. To help somebody like that, somebody's in that situation maybe, to help somebody like that, you don't want to just tell them what to do, because that, especially from an advisor or a parent, that's quite alienating, that it doesn't connect. What you want to try to do is to get them to change in a way that connects to something, that relates to something like, you can point out, hey, the fact that you're bored in these classes is actually meaningful. That's some information there that you should pay attention to. So I think the value fulfillment theory does a good job and a better job than other theories of explaining how to be helpful to people in ordinary contexts. The last thing that I think the theory has in its favor is that even if you don't like it as a theory, paying attention to people's values is important no matter what theory you have. So perfectionism says exercise your human capacities. Apparently that's what you get when you put Aristotle and Einstein together, and I thought that seemed like a good picture of perfectionism to my mind. So perfectionism says exercise your human capacities. Well, which ones? I mean, we all have tons of them, and in what way? If you're a perfectionist, how are you going to advise people? How are you going to help people? Seems to me you have to pay attention to people's values, even if you're a perfectionist. If you're a hedonist, the thought is, live a life full of pleasure. Well, what pleasures? Pleasure from what? Pleasure from doing difficult tasks and achieving, getting a pleasant sense of achievement, or pleasure from relationships, or pleasure from what kinds of relationships? I think if you're a hedonist, you also need to pay attention to people's values. Last thing, I said the last thing was the last thing, but this is actually the last thing. So I think that the value fulfillment theory answers the what matters question. This opens up a really big philosophical can of worms, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. But the basic point is value fulfillment theory is tied to what individual people think matters. And it also has built into it room for improvement. And to my mind, that's as good as we can do at answering the what matters question. But I will leave that there, except to say there's a way in which psychologists actually accept this explanation for the what matters question. So Ed Diener says, the reason subjective well-being is so important is that people everywhere think that it's very important. In other words, I think what he's saying is people value subjective well-being. That's why it's important. And what I would say to Dr. Happiness is, yes, subjective well-being is important because people value it, and many other things are important as well. Things that psychologists maybe aren't very good at measuring, but they are important nonetheless. So the last section I'm going to skip right and just go right to the end. I thought I might need to do this. And just say one thing about the future direction of some of my research. So I've spent the last million years thinking about well-being. Now I'm trying to think a little bit about ill-being. What is it for a life to go badly? And I've been thinking about examples from literature of lives that kind of fail. Lily Bart, as you might have seen the slides, Lily Bart from House of Mirth is, I think, a great example of a person whose life went tragically poorly. And I think those kinds of examples are really illuminating, and in some ways more illuminating, or maybe just illuminating of something different but also important than the examples you get from psychology of ill-being, which are basically examples of psychiatric illness. The reason I think that some of these examples from literature are so important is that they give you a glimpse into what it's like to be someone who isn't you, with different values, different priorities, a different sense of what it means to fulfill those values, different standards from yours. One of the things I spend quite a bit of time talking about is that in friendship, when we try to help each other, we suffer from a kind of self-centered bias that makes us think that however it is for us, it's exactly the same as it is for our friends. So I think the thing that friends need to do to be helpful and good friends is to cultivate a certain kind of humility about what it's like to be another person. And I really think examples from literature help us do that more than the kinds of things we read in popular psychology books or psychology research. So my thought here about the dogs is that these two dogs have a very different experience of walking through a mud puddle. Depends a lot on your height. So what I've talked about is that psychologists have really important things to say about subjective well-being, and I don't want to undermine how important that is. I've learned a lot from them. But philosophers are asking different kinds of questions. We're not trying to measure something, so we're able to ask the question about what matters. I've also tried to say a little bit about why I think the value fulfillment theory is a pretty good theory about what matters. And then last, the section I didn't really get to is I do think that examples from literature are helpful in really illuminating the kinds of rich ways in which our lives could go better or worse. And I will just end by saying thank you. Oh, yeah.
We have a few minutes for question and answer period. If you have questions for Dr. Tiberius, please raise your hand. I will bring around the mic so that we can capture the questions on our recording. Questions in the audience?
So I like your theory, and I liked your criticisms of the other theories that you considered. But I wanted to it may be that I don't exactly understand the theory, but I wanted to you to consider, imagine a person who has values that are fulfilled, but the values themselves are very simple. Maybe they haven't had a chance to travel, they haven't had a chance to really experience the world, maybe they haven't had the privilege of higher education, and so maybe the things that they value, these simple little things, eating pancakes, I don't know, playing video games, they get to fulfill them. On your view, I'm thinking that would turn out to be, someone who has high well-being, as opposed to maybe your astronaut person who they have conflicting values, but they might be living, trying to balance it out and living a really, what intuitively would seem like a better life. So I just wanted to...
Yeah, that's a great question and not an easy question to answer quickly. So a few things. First, I think it's a failing that philosophers fall into to think that lives, not you, I'm not, this is not, but some philosophers, and probably me too, to think that people whose lives don't resemble ours in their intellectual pursuits and complexity are not as good as our lives. So I have a portion of my family who are Mormon. I gotta say we're not close, but a few of my cousins that I stay in touch with on Facebook, their lives are actually they're fairly simple. I mean, one of my cousins stays home with her kids. She has no career aspirations. She doesn't have hobbies that are outside of her family. On my view, she is achieving fairly high well-being, and if you knew her, it would be hard to disagree with that conclusion. The thing is that lots of people who are in that position don't like being in that position and end up bored. I think my cousin, as far as I can tell, she's not bored, but many people who are not able to enjoy a university education or travel or these other opportunities, they do get bored, and that, on my view, would detract from their well-being. There's a lot more to say about that, but we're having dinner.
Other questions?
So you went over the flaws of other. You went over the flaws of some other philosophical ideas. So, what are the flaws of your theory?
That's a good question. One of the main flaws with my theory that people enjoy pointing out is that, on my view, and this is also true for some other theories, but it is a criticism I get thrown at me quite a bit. A person who lives a grossly immoral life could be achieving well-being. So Ramsay Bolton, are you Game of Thrones? Do you watch Game of Thrones? Oh, students need to watch more television. This is a terrible thing. Okay, so I'm trying to think of somebody who's just a really bad guy, a mass murderer. In principle, on my theory, they could be achieving well-being. I think it's very unlikely that someone who's grossly immoral could achieve well-being, because I think there's lots of conflict for people, conflict with the people they're in relationship with, for people who have immoral values. But it is a possibility, and that possibility really annoys people. So.
Other questions? question over there.
I'm wondering if there's an aspect of your theory that includes the amount of work people have to do towards fulfilling their values, and whether or not someone who might just be very lucky in life might feel as fulfilled as someone who's maybe had to work more towards these values, fulfillment.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one of the things I think is useful about the examples from literature is that they highlight the role of luck. Because some people in stories, their lives go terribly, but if one thing had been different, it could have gone so much better. So I don't have a particular view about that. I think it's just a fact of life that luck profoundly influences how well we can do. And the question about how much work you need to do to fulfill your values, I guess you were thinking of that as the thing that's influenced by luck, that some people will have to do more than others and through no fault of their own, right?
Yeah, so I was just thinking like some people just get lucky.
Yep.
Because it affects other people's amount of work.
Yeah, so one thing about that is for many values, the work is part of the fulfillment, right? So, if you have as a hobby doing some kind of music, like you sing or play piano or even enjoy music, it's not like you fulfill it and then it's done. The fulfillment is the process of learning the instrument, playing new music, finding new things to listen to. Similarly with work, it's not like, you get the job and then you're done, it's fulfilled. The work is an ongoing, you fulfill the value continuously over time. So that is also influenced by luck. But I think it's just important to recognize that work is not just instrumental to getting something that, a prize at the end. Yeah, it's a great question.
All right, well, please join me again in thanking Professor Tiberius for her time.